This is Concept Pending. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Doug Johnson. I have Myra DeHoyas with us. I have Greg Holkin, and we're ready to get going. I think this time we're going to talk about a few things that a lot of our fans have asked us about when we go to these shows and kind of chit chat around. And we constantly get asked, what's the design process and how'd you come up with this idea, and where did it come from? Those ideas come from a lot of places. Everybody here working on the team is super well versed, not only within the industry and what we do, but also within the properties that we work on. So everybody's full of ideas. Everybody has their own projects that they've led or initiated or surfaced the idea, and that's we all just kind of brainstorm about cool ideas, kind of dig into them from there and identify how we can set ourselves apart. So as the year goes, we have like major collections or marketing beats you may call, but specifically because we are a convention going brand, like those conventions really drive a lot of our marketing and a lot of our focus in terms of what are we going to do that's new and fresh and going to be exciting to go to a show and really show out and have a good presence there. Those conventions do drive a lot of our focus because they will be our big plays throughout the year. Just that being said, I mean, that's where, a lot of the larger collections and more conceptual ideas live. And then, obviously throughout the year, everything we do, we want to be different, we want to be new, we want to be fresh, but sometimes it's on a smaller scale than what it would be for a major event like that.
It's all about relative need, right? Because it's, a convention's going to need a little more development, a little more work. Like you're going to need a booth, you're going to need promotions, you're going to need to be able to talk to people. But then across the course of the year, it's not just all conventions, right? So you're going to have to scale the amount of effort and work you put into like everything around it based on, how big it is and what it's in support of. Because, we'll support movies or shows or, like anniversaries, things like that, in addition to timing marketing beats with shows.
For sure. Shows we have to be very lean on. Like it's a very costly investment to participate in a show. People would probably be surprised at what the costs are. Like just getting carpet in your booth is it's like buying a Honda Accord. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Wow.
How expensive these things are. And with it being such a high overhead investment, we have to knock it out of the park. It's got to be spot on, and every single SKU that we bring is a cost, and we don't want to ship it home because that's a cost as well. So
that does explain why toy fairs I've had to go to for work, previous places I've been, why there wasn't any carpet in the booth.
Yeah.
12 hours a day on like concrete floor, rough.
Yeah.
Been there. So that's just for carpet, and then if you want to actually have comfortable carpet, you have to pay for the foam that goes under the carpet, which is in addition. So it's not cheap. It's not easy. So yeah, that's why when it's a show, it's like hyper focused. We're hyper focused on everything we do, but it is very, very, very important that everything we do there is a home run. And it's a shot in the dark too. Like a lot of times it's nerve-wracking, right? Like you don't know how the customer's going to react. You don't know how the turnout at that particular show is going to be. There's a lot of things that can affect it. Obviously, like the pandemic had a huge effect on everything we did there. Like that shut down everything. We didn't get to go to shows, so it was like you weren't in front of the customer and you weren't having that direct feedback, and that was just a crappy time to
Yeah.
Well, and we've had a couple, right, where we had a concept, we're starting to work on it, and then a show comes up before the one we're aiming for, and somebody else snipes it out from underneath us. And so we got to pivot and do something different at the last second.
That's definitely one, is having to pivot very quickly.
100%. And I think what you brought up, so it's a minute ago you brought up, like other people are going to be doing this too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's
And you have to be aware.
It's an anniversary. Yeah, it's Return of the Jedi. San Diego Comic-Con 23, our camp vibe, right? We're in the Lucas Pavilion. Lucas is pressing Return of the Jedi anniversary to everybody they work with and to everybody in the community, right? Like everybody knows this is a thing. How do you show up in a sea of Star Wars, Return of the Jedi anniversary and stand apart from what's out there?
Make an actual statement.
Right.
And stand out.
I mean, I guess that's a decent example to kind of elaborate on.
The camp collection, I actually hadn't seen the Return of the Jedi in a while, so I did a rewatch. And when I was watching it, I was like, man, they spent a lot of time in that forest. And then, when we were trying to kind of conceptualize and do something different, I was like, well, wouldn't it be cool? You go camping on Endor with the Ewoks, and that kind of started the conversation, and then we started getting more input from the rest of the team members, and hey, we should also address the locations. And so we kind of started making little badges, almost like you're getting like a little patch from every camp that you visited through the galaxy. And then after that, we kind of started throwing in the aesthetic of current items that make sense. So we didn't want it to look dated, so everything was trend right, what was in the market. People
have seen the camp thing, Camp on Endor, and they've got like the little Ewok dressed up like the park ranger and stuff like that. Like that, that's there. It's out there. I think we kind of took a different perspective on like, yes, it's a camp collection, but it's not only a camp collection. It's like a road trip. It's like a summer road trip destination camp type of scenario where you're visiting the desert and you're visiting the forest and you're visiting the swamp. And that's awesome idea that kind of came out. The film shows you all these different places, and they spend these moments there, and that was just not only that, but like bringing it into the real world, the idea we're going to San Diego Comic-Con in the summer out in California. It's like, for all intents and purposes, San Diego Comic-Con is the summer camp for grown adult nerds. Like if you're, you know what I'm saying? It's like
there's even a pageant. They show up in cosplay, right?
Yeah. And everybody, when you went to summer camp as a kid, is like the things you look forward to were, number one, like no parents, right? Like you could get into stuff, you could do things. And number two was to seeing your friends that you hadn't seen for an entire year that you only hang out with when you go to summer camp. And I feel like that's super relatable to how we all feel going to San Diego, is you're gonna see your buddies, you're gonna have a good time, and there's no like super rules. Like you can do whatever you want, you can dress up, you can go out and party, like there's all these events. So it was very relatable to what, SDCC is. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was a fun idea. And Myra had like taken the lead in the beginning there. We knew we wanted to do something, fun for Return of the Jedi. And so Myra had created like a series of like patches and these little badges and stuff, and for specifically to like apply on like canvas bags and things like that. And so it was easy then to kind of pass that around the team. We had this kind of defined aesthetic at that point, which was like kind of this retro camp, going into the worlds and pulling the colors from those worlds to apply to those assets that we would use to represent those worlds. Like the Tatooine stuff was all like orange, yellow, red, sandy colors, right?
And then Endor.
What people don't realize is even just picking out colors makes such a difference, because we have the orange and the blues, but with us wanting to kind of keep that vintage vibe, it's looking for like a more burnt colors and darker shades, and all of that really kind of comes into play.
Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comics, has really an interesting sequence where he talks about color. Almost the whole book's in black and white, right? Except he's got a section in it in color. And in it, he's talking about design of characters and things like that, and readability, and how you can tell what character the colors represent based on proportions of the colors. And all he has is he shows color blocks, right, of like, there's green, a purple, and a green, and you're like, well, that's Hulk, right? And then you got blue and red and a little bit of white and Spider-Man, right? Which, I mean, he's not the only place where that pops up, but it's a good example, right, of why it's important to carefully select colors so that they, work a certain way and can be recognized as speaking to something particular.
Yeah, and I think, like, to Myra's point, it was, like, yeah, you could pick this super saturated orange or this really bright blue or whatever, but like the general tone was like we want it kind of rustic and kind of I don't know,
Well,
like retro, I guess.
Yeah, but you kind of want the pieces to look like worn, like you've been through
Right.
all of these locations.
Right.
You've been taking your gear with you.
In general, like I think Heroes and Villains kind of like we stick with, for all intents and purposes, and everybody can call us out on this where I'm wrong, but we don't necessarily use stark white. Like, we don't have a stark white t-shirt. They're all natural. They're all slightly off-white. We don't have, I mean, we do have some black t-shirts or whatever, but generally when we're creating print or any other kind of art application, we stick with like a vintage black. We don't use full saturation colors. Generally, we're always kind of playing with the saturation of the color. And I think that it all just kind of like makes a brand statement, right? Like, you're choosing cool colors versus just slapping on what the art's provided and how it traditionally looks. So color is a huge part, and it's part of the design process. So we're got off on a tangent and started talking specifically about that collection, but for all collections, it's always an important piece, and it's always at the beginning. Identify your colors, especially, a lot of times, like I said, one of the team members will be on point for whatever said collection it is, and part of that role is to pick those colors and identify them so that when it is time to like share and broaden it with everybody else, it's already done. Yeah. Right? And everybody, like we've said before, like...
Yeah, we all take turns.
Yeah, and Myra's focus on accessories and bags, and Greg's focus on men's apparel, and Heather's focused on women's apparel and accessories to a bit. All those things, like, it's a different look for each kind of your worlds.
Yeah, and that's the thing when picking stuff like that, you have to make sure that it makes sense across all the different item types.
Exactly. So like if you're using like burnt oranges and these like desaturated reds and off-whites or whatever for whatever collection, say it's Tatooine, then when Heather picks that up, if she wants to do something in like a blue, she can match the saturation and make it jive with the burnt oranges and things that you're using. So color is huge in the beginning. And like I said, so art development, that kind of takes a minute. So I want us to just step back for just a minute because we kind of got ahead of ourselves. Yeah. So like the design process, number one, ideation, right? We all know that we're going to do something for San Diego or for Return of the Jedi, right? We'll use that as the ongoing example. But in the beginning, it's this idea, right? Myra wants to do this camp. It's this retro thing, right? Like, so from there, it's, hey, everybody, what do you think? Like, hey, let's kick this around. Yes, and that's like the constant, right? Like that's what we expect out of every team member is that it's a yes and they add to the conversation. So
right, we're all pitching in, not just sitting back.
Yeah, and that's why it kind of keeps evolving because you start getting a little input from the team members.
It starts bouncing off everybody, and
the hardest part is getting there, getting to that point, and then once it gets to that point, everybody's involved and everybody's bouncing around, and then the ideas start to come out of the woodwork. When you begin that process, you're like, okay, we want it this vibe, that vibe, whatever. Then people start looking at actual garments, actual fabrics. If we're gonna make it like camp retro, it's gonna be, softer cotton fabrics, dry fabrics. Whereas if we're doing like something super techy or it's like, oh, it's a Batman like gadget collection or whatever, you're looking at more of like the poly fabrics and more of like the technical aspects of everything, matte black and metal hardware and all this stuff. So like that overarching theme in the beginning defines everything to follow. And there's certain aspects in terms of like the garments and the build and the look and feel of what the accessories may be that are guided by that.
Especially for the bags, fabric is probably one of the most important parts, and then picking out the fabrics that make sense, and also durability and all that really kind of helps set the tone. But it's like a really important part.
Yeah, and then silhouettes, right?
Yeah.
Silhouettes, like that's a common term within the industry, and I don't know. I mean, if you do or don't know what it is, we can explain. Silhouettes is basically the body of the item, right? So
it's like the difference between a raglan t-shirt where it has the sleeves that kind of come up in an angle from the armpit, and like a normal t-shirt where it's,
Right. Or a crew neck versus a hoodie or, whatever. It's like define your silhouettes. And within a silhouette, it can be intricate, like Greg's talking about. So like a t-shirt is a silhouette, but is it a raglan, right? Is it a drop hem? Is it, a more boxy shape? Like finding the silhouettes is another key piece to that. Like Myra's saying, the fabrics are key to telling the same story, but the silhouettes are key as well. So if you want this retro camp vibe, then you're going to naturally look for silhouettes in apparel and accessories that relate to that theme. So that's a very important part of the process, because we have things that we do on a day-to-day, and we know like the back of our hands. We do it all the time. Like if it's a standard hoodie, yeah, we got that covered. Yeah. But if we're like, oh well, wouldn't it be cool if we did this like quilted hoodie with this pocket over here, and maybe over here it has this like elastic piece and da 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 da, and it turns into this like extravagant adventure or whatever, right? That's very important, for us to bring ideas like that and to take risks and build stuff. And in that scenario, as soon as we know we want to do this, we must involve our PD side of the team.
Product development, they're the folks it's where the rubber meets the road, right? They're talking with the factories, they're building the technical specifications and whatnot that we need to actually get things produced.
Right. So a lot of times, like, what we do is we research the market. That's kind of our job, is to identify what's out there, what's not out there, and find where we fit in and what would be fun. So a lot of things that we do are existing in the market, just not within our licensed world. Reference samples help a lot. A lot of times we're ordering things that we find online so that we can see the actual fabrication, we can see the fabrics, we can understand the techniques of art or whatever that are applied.
Instruction.
Yeah. Those things like are very important up front, because that's one of the longest processes in the process. I said process twice in a row, but it is a very long, part of the process, because if you are going to create a new jacket or a new style of hoodie or whatever, there are different aspects to that. I don't know if you want to expand on, what that process is, but
if you're starting with a piece that we've done before, it's a little easier, right? Because they've already got a lot of the technical stuff worked out, and you need to talk with them up front in case you're doing something that's different. For example, if we do one of our crew fleece sweatshirts, right, that has a lot of embroidery and some print on it and stuff, and maybe has some paneling. That's something we've done before, but they need to know the specifics of what you're doing, like how much embroidery, are you doing any paneling? If you are, where, how is the sleeve connecting, all of that stuff, even though it's something fairly familiar, right? But if you're doing something new that we've not done before, for example, if you wanted to do like a knit sweater, right? You need to go to them and explain it and have a sample that they can use and speak with their factories. Find which factory is going to do the best job. Find out how to construct it, what they need to do on their end to get artwork ready for the factory. All of those things that need to be done to smooth the way so that production can happen without any real horrifying surprises, which surprises are the thing we like least. with a sample of something that you're doing that's new, you can look at the material that's used. You can look at, sort of art techniques you can use. Like if you're doing like a sweater or something, would it be a jacquard? Could you do appliques? Like, could you do,
Right.
yeah.
If it's a new cut, we hand this off to PD, product development. We have a product development team that's focused on this stuff. They're incredible, very technical. They have to create this cut and sew body. So they literally have to pass this off and have it drawn out in panels cut.
Basically deconstructed.
Yes, how the garment is going to be put together. We have, as designers, a hand in that process simply by how we design or draw the item. Then when we have the conversation with our product development, we can specify those details of what we want to include on these cuts. From there, once we have that cut, then it's basically, it's a die line for creating the item. As far as art application goes to these items, because we buy sized apparel from extra small up to XXX, art placement is key and needs to be defined when you go into this process. So those panels and those pieces come back and they then create what we call nesting guides. Nesting guides are guidelines for us as designers to place art on apparel.
So the factory knows where to put it to make it come out the way we want.
Right. We don't have the luxury of creating artwork by size. The artwork has to be created to fit every single size in one run. If we're going to put a chest patch on the wearer's right chest, we're going to need to know that on every single piece, not irrelevant of size, it's going to land 3 inches down from the top seam or from the ribbing, 3 inches from the, the cut under the shoulder or whatever it is. We have to identify specifically that on these nesting guides before we can actually pass it back over to product development to go into sampling. So that's part of that process. It's real, I don't know if it's interesting or boring or what, but it's a part of the process and it's a technical.
Well, it's definitely a piece of problem solving every time, right? You got to look at it. You can't just slap it on there and run. You have to look at it and think about it.
100%, because if you're making a XXX, the art placement is set for a small or a medium.
It's gonna look weird.
Yeah, the 3X is going to come in and the art's going to be teeny tiny.
Right. But if you size it perfectly for the 3X, then it's going to come in on the small and it's going to be giant.
It's going to bleed off the seam.
So it's finding the middle ground where it'll make sense for the biggest and the smallest, and that in itself can be a challenge.
100%. Because when you draw one piece, right? You're I'm drawing this and it looks awesome and I got everything placed right where I want it. And then it turns into this how do I make it work on this larger scale,
And that's part of the reason why it's so important to constantly talk with product development. Yeah, you got to keep talking with them because as you're working, issues may come up. Things that weren't foreseen may happen. That's another reason why it's important to talk to them early. Because you may be like, hey, this is awesome. I found something. I kind of want to do this. And they'll look at it and they'll be like, well, I don't know that our factory can do that, or it would be, prohibitive for some reason. So you wind up having to make an adjustment on the fly, or it's important to have a dialogue with them the whole way through the process.
Another thing that's really important is that you have to be willing to adapt very quickly, and you can't really be married to anything. You have to understand that, sometimes factories have certain capabilities that we can't do. So that's another thing. You just have to be real quick on, let's pivot, let's change it to this and that.
Yeah, if you get too overly precious about it, then it winds up biting you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So and then, Myra's work on that end is a little different because she kind of plays the role on the accessories, as far as the PD.
Yeah. So since I've been working with these factories for well over a decade, I do communicate directly with them. So it's another thing too where I, for example, a travel bag. Before I even start drawing it, I do send them some examples, try to figure out, their capabilities, what makes sense. And then, once I get the okay on that, then I go ahead and start actually constructing the shape, first drawing out the spec. Every single stitch and seam is on these drawings. And then once we get the approval on that, it's time to sample it. And then I actually have to go through and pick out every single fabric that goes in there. I have to kind of call out what type of art technique. Is it a metal badge? Is it a PU patch? You know, it's calling all those things out. I have to size everything. I print out a lot and make like little paper molds because it does take a while to get those samples in. So I want to try to get it as close as possible to perfect. And then
that's an important part though. Like, it's not just on your end, but like we'll often like cut stuff out, like especially hats, things like that, because you have to make sure it looks right. You can't just eyeball it and guess every time, right?
Yeah. On the computer, you can see, oh, this round patch is 3 inches. That looks about right. But then you print it out and you see it in person and you're like, wow, that looks ridiculously large on this panel. So, you know, we're not just on the computer. There's a lot of hands-on printing stuff out. I mean, sometimes to try to figure out straps, I literally cut pieces of webbing and I'm like pinning things and how does it cross here? How does it attach there? How does it hang there? There's a lot more than just, you know, drawing it. And then it's putting out all the specs. So I have to measure out like every single panel and all that, and then kind of figure out how to explain to a factory how to construct it as best I can, trying to be as illustrative as possible with, you know, how the construction is put together, and then send it out to the factories, and then just constant communication with them back and forth, making sure the product is what we were asking for, stuff like that.
Yeah, that it meets expectations. So yeah, I mean, like with Myra's stuff, I worked in accessories for a long time as well. Also have done like a lot of headwear and things like that. I've done a few bags, as a matter of fact. Yeah. We also have trims and swatches, resources that are sourced from these factories that we work with. So we have like market fabric, right? So Myra is digging through these crates full of fabrics of different weights or
texture.
Yes, texture, and like some of them are coated, some of them aren't, some of them, you know, are washed, some of them have a wax canvas, you know, whatever. But it's such an intricate process, and there's so many factors, like especially in bags, like there's fillers, there's linings, there's, you know, internal organization,
closures.
Closures, like is this speed clip gonna just pop loose, or is it like the webbing, for example, right? Different types of those, you cinch your compression piece up or your straps down. Certain webbing's not going to hold on specific types of like it'll slide out.
Yeah, so it's stuff like that too.
Yeah, there's so many intricacies. It's crazy.
And then even like when picking the fabrics, I literally have to like grab all the different ones that I'm thinking of and like put them all together, because you have to make sure that they make sense together and they're not clashing. So that in itself is another challenge.
Yeah, and it's funny because that is a huge challenge. And it's funny because everybody knows what a swatch is. Like, it's like 1.5 inches square.
Yeah.
You know, you're like, oh, it's a cool color, and then all of a sudden you see it in a full freaking backpack or a bomber jacket, and you're like, oh.
It's yeah.
Yeah. That's always a funny like piece to it, is like, yeah, I like the color, but I know if I see this thing in a big like 3-foot square, it's gonna give me an aneurysm. So
yeah.
Oh, and then Myra's building what she calls a tech pack.
Yes.
The tech pack is what is delivered to the factory, and then the tech pack dictates everything about the product being built. It has all the art, it has all the cuts, it has the measurements, everything lives within this tech pack.
It's like a set of blueprints for the factory to follow.
Yeah.
Yes. And then, I mean, as you guys have seen with some of our backpacks, there's so many pockets and compartments. Sometimes those tech packs can be like over 40 pages of just explanation, because you have to call out every single inner pocket, how big it is, how deep it is.
If it has gussets.
If it has gusset, how many zipper pullers you want on each pocket. It's very, very detailed, but you know, our factories are really great at listening to the entire encyclopedia that I sent them.
So ideation, we identified colors, we're identifying silhouettes, we've roped in PD in the initial conversations of what we're thinking about doing. Then we went off on a tangent about how we actually do it, but that was a little bit of insight there. And then so now that we have PD looped in, these are some of the shapes we're talking about doing. Art development is a key part of this process, right? So we know like the theme, the general overview of what the vibe's going to be, what kind of fabrics, what kind of shapes, what kind of materials, these types of things that we pull, searching the internet and our Pinterest boards and, whatever to kind of say this is the general look and feel. But when it comes to art development, we have to curate that within the team and say first of all, we're provided assets from licensors, right? Everybody on this team has logins to go into an IP website and dig through assets. That's not to say that we have full access to everything that's ever been created for any of these.
They all curate everything.
Exactly. We only have access to what is provided. And on the flip side of that, so does everybody else that's licensed to make that IP.
And most of those people just go in, grab something, and slap it on whatever they're making.
Now, Greg, you wouldn't be...
How could I dare to impugn the reputation of our competitors?
I wasn't going to say everybody did that, but I was going to say we like to avoid doing that.
Yeah, because we don't want someone to be able to see something similar in the market.
Right. I mean, everybody's seen it. It's like you see this graphic and you're like, oh, it's at this one retailer and it's at that other retailer and I can buy it on Amazon. And, it's like, oh, okay.
At a certain point, it becomes not about the product you're selling, and it becomes about price, right? If it's available multiple places, it's less special and it becomes more of a commodity.
Art development's a huge piece of that. So we will identify assets that we will use. It's just a matter of how we will use those. So we may be using the same assets that anybody else may be using that you may find on Amazon for all intents and purposes, but it will be reworked under the heroes and villains filter to fit into the collection that we're building.
Yeah, we'll tear it apart, redraw parts of it, we'll combine it with other pieces from their library.
Exactly. Yeah, build onto it, whatever, deconstruct it, whatever. And obviously the color piece ties into that whole thing. But what I'm getting at here is that art curation starts the process of developing what kind of applications you're going to apply to these products, right? Because when we talk about apparel, screen prints and puff prints and HD prints and there's all these different types of prints and there's limitations to those prints. We do a lot of embroidery, we do a lot of patches. There's different types of patches. There's different types of embroidery. There's chain stitch, there's flat embroidery, 3D embroidery, all these things. With bags, it's a whole nother thing because we're not making full color screen prints on bags and pattern building, things like that, linings that we're going to create. So we take these assets and make patterns and they're going to be sublimated, printed on interior linings of bomber jackets and things like that. So that's a huge piece that everybody needs to understand that if Myra brings this patch idea, those patches are specific to embroidered execution, right? They have to be a certain level of simplicity to be able to embroider. They can't be highly detailed. They can't have too many colors. There can't be gradients within that artwork. Things like that you just inherently have to know when you're working with specific products and how you're going to execute the art on those products. So I think we do a good job collectively as a team. I know Greg does a bang up job when he creates almost like a style guide. It's our own internal style guide based on the assets that we've already identified and what can we add to them and make it look like a cohesive style guide for all of us to use. And when you create that, part of it has to be very simplified for us to be able to execute embroidered patches or
across different pieces.
Right. But then to expand on that, we want to make some really awesome t-shirt graphics, right, that kind of round out the collection. Yeah. And that's where AC comes in and plays a huge role, and he can kind of vibe off of the things that have already been started and we can expand. We have a little more leniency when it comes to that type of thing, right? A digitally printed graphic gives you a lot more leniency in terms of colors, gradients, detail of the art, things like that. Obviously we have to be cognizant of it because it's not all that simple, but it does allow you a lot more freedom than an embroidered patch. Yeah. That's kind of the next step right? Getting the art all curated, pulled together, and I think everybody does a good job playing a hand in that. And like Myra can go pull from a graphic that we've built that's like intended for a t-shirt or something and still be able to identify how the colors would play for a embroidered patch, right? And to like pull elements that could build that out.
And we have to talk about colors while we're working on stuff like this because our factories don't all use the same color standards, which it would be so awesome if they all did. But like we have to talk back and forth so that we can keep a color palette that everybody can use.
Yeah, well, you're working in so many different categories with so many different factories.
So many different art techniques.
Yeah. Exactly. That's a good point. Some of it's just picking the fabric out of your fabric swatches. Yeah. Others would be embroidered thread. Like, what's the thread color
that we're going to use to build this? Yeah.
Of the embroidery, and then prints is like a whole nother situation. So yeah, I mean it's a great point. And then like metal finishes, for example, right? You've got all the different metal finishes. Some factories may produce the same metal finish, but it looks different than this other factory, right? Like this could be antique nickel, and that one's antique nickel, but looks more like brushed nickel, and they call them both the same thing, and you're like, this doesn't work.
That's another thing too. It's almost like you have like a dictionary for every different factory on what they call certain things. We can't just really kind of designate names to things.
Right. It's very specific by the product you're building and who you're working with. Yeah, and then art curation, I think maybe there's a step I address, but maybe it's somewhere around in the same general location. We have to go back to our partners. We have to pitch this idea. We have to show them our research and why we want to do this idea. That's another big thing. I'll just go ahead and say that I ask that all of the designers that work at Heroes and Villains have a reason for what they're doing. That's identified by research, right? So like if you're going to do something new, you're going to know what's been done. So you have to go out there and see what's been done and then identify your white space and is it going to vibe with your target audience. And so that's kind of the pitch deck that we have to put together to convince a licensor to give us the leniency to whatever direction we're wanting to explore. If we're manipulating the artwork or we're creating our own assets or we're recoloring and all these things, those are all things that have to be approved. And we want to get ahead of that as far as we can because we don't want to go all the way through this process and have this beautiful collection built and then them say, no, you can't do, indoor camp patches. Like that's just, we're really against that and you can't do it. Then we're just squashed.
Yeah,
right?
and then that whole idea is gone.
Yeah.
You got to start from scratch. Whereas if you do it gradually as you work, any setbacks are less devastating. Right. Yeah.
Like you can pivot if they come back and they're like, we don't like this color. Pick out another color, resend it. Okay, we're cool with that color and we're off to the races. But if you get to the end and they don't like the color.
And you realize that three-quarters of your collection uses it, yeah,
your collection's over with and by now it's too late and you're not going to go to San Diego Comic-Con and have anything cool. Yeah. Like, yes, it's a very important part of the process. So we want to get ahead of that up front. Then, all the other things we talked about, roll through that.
Doug, we're getting the high sign. It kind of looks like we're running long on time. Do we want to maybe break this up into a part 2?
All right. So, yeah, I guess that's it. Thanks for hanging out with us. Concept Pending by Heroes and Villains is the podcast. Check out the website, heroesvillains.com. Follow us on social at Heroes Villains Brand. And I guess we'll
see you next time.
Yeah. See you next time.